I am back in a classroom. That is how this story ends. So I will say it at the beginning. I am 68 years old, and I am standing in front of 22 14-year-olds, 5 days a week at a secondary school in Liverpool, teaching English literature the way I taught it for 35 years before I retired, and then stopped retiring, and then came back to teaching because the alternative was sitting in my flat doing arithmetic about how long £11,000 would last. A man with no other income. I am not complaining about being back. Teaching is what I know, and I am not without gratitude for having something to return to. What I am is honest, and honestly, this is not what retirement was supposed to look like. My name is Nathan Prescott. I spent 35 years teaching English literature at a comprehensive school in Liverpool. I was not a famous teacher or a celebrated one, I was a steady one, which in 35 years of comprehensive education is worth something. I read the books alongside my students every year, which kept the work alive for me longer than it might have otherwise. I cared about what I was doing, which made the physical and emotional toll of it bearable but did not make it lighter. By the time I reached 67, I had been tired for a decade in the way that secondary school teachers become tired deeply and structurally at the level of the week's rhythm and the year's rhythm and the accumulation of 35 years of those rhythms. When my head teacher called me in to discuss my retirement plans in the spring of 2022, I told him I was ready, and I meant it more than I had ever meant a professional statement in my career. I had £420,000 in savings. This requires a brief explanation because it is a significant sum for a comprehensive school teacher in Liverpool, and I want to be clear about where it came from. My parents passed within 18 months of each other in 2018 and 2019, leaving me the proceeds of the sale of the family home in Wirral and a modest investment portfolio my father had built steadily over 30 years. The inheritance was £310,000. Combined with my own savings from 35 years of careful living, the total reached £420,000. I had never been wealthy. I had been careful. The £420,000 represented a lifetime of careful living, mine and my parents', and I had always understood it that way. My plan for retirement was not extravagance, it was comfort. A decent flat, modest travel, enough margin to handle whatever health costs the coming decades might bring. I had run the numbers, carefully, the way a teacher who has never had money to spare runs numbers conservatively and more than once. I landed in Manila in September of 2022. The retirement trip was meant to be the celebration 3 weeks in the Philippines before I settled into the quieter rhythms of retired life in Liverpool. I had chosen the Philippines because a colleague named Marjorie, who had retired 2 years before me, had spent a month there with her daughter and returned describing it as the most vivid and welcoming place she had visited anywhere. Marjorie is not a dramatic person, which made her enthusiasm notable. I booked 3 weeks, a modest hotel in Manila for the first few days, and a looser itinerary after that. I met Aliana Reyes on my second day. She was the booking agent at a tour and travel desk in the lobby of the hotel where I was staying, not a large luxury hotel, a mid-range one that suited my budget, the kind of place that has a desk near the entrance where a professional helps guests arrange day trips, transport, and excursion packages. Aliana was 37 years old, and she had been working that desk, she told me later, for 6 years. She was efficient and knowledgeable, and she asked, when I approached to ask about day trip options, what kind of traveler I was, whether I wanted organized groups or independent arrangements, whether I was more interested in history or landscape or food. These were good questions that showed she understood the difference between tourists. I told her I was flexible, that this was my first proper holiday in years, that I had just retired after 35 years of teaching. She said, "Then you should do something you've never done before." I asked what she meant. She said, "Not the standard tour, something that actually feels like a celebration." I want to describe what happened in the following 40 minutes carefully, because 40 minutes was all it took for the direction of the next 4 months to be established. Aliana pulled out a folder, a physical one, well organized, with tabs that contained options at various price levels. She started at the middle of the folder and worked outward. She showed me a 3-day Palawan package that included private island access and a boat charter, £2,800 for one person. She showed me a Siargao surfing and villa stay that she said was where the Manila wealthy went when they wanted to feel away from everything, £3,200 for 5 days. She showed me, almost as an aside, a suite upgrade at a boutique hotel in BGC that she said her clients, who were celebrating milestones, sometimes used as a base for a week in the city, £1,900 for the week. Each option was presented not as a sales pitch but as information, the way a knowledgeable person presents options to someone who deserves to make an informed choice. And between each option she said small things, not pushy things, just observations. After 35 years, you've earned something like this. Most people who come here at your stage of life say they wish they'd spent a bit more on the first trip. You can always save money later. This is the celebration trip. I am not naive. I have been in classrooms long enough to recognize when someone is working towards something, and I recognized it. And I sat across from her and felt the pull of it anyway, because she was touching something true, the specific hunger of a man who had lived carefully for 35 years and had, for the first time in his adult life, permission to stop. I booked the Palawan package that afternoon, £2,800. I told myself it was the celebration trip, which was what she had called it, and the framing held. Palawan was extraordinary. I am not going to pretend otherwise. I have been honest about everything else, and I will be honest about this. The water was the color I had seen in photographs and dismissed as enhancement. The boat we chartered moved through limestone formations that felt genuinely ancient in a way that a man who teaches literature understands as a category distinct from impressive. I spent 3 days in a state of alertness that I had not felt in years, noticing things, being present in the way that the school term had not allowed me to be present for longer than I could accurately remember. I called Marjorie from a beach on the second day and said, "You were right." She said, "I know." It was the best 3 days I had spent in the previous decade. When I got back to Manila, Aliana asked how it was. I told her honestly and at length. She listened and said, "That's what I thought you needed." Then she said, "How much time do you have left?" I told her 10 days. She said, "Then let's use them properly." She opened the folder again. Over the following 10 days, Aliana booked me into a different category of experience for each one. A helicopter tour of the Chocolate Hills in Bohol, £1,400. 2 nights at a resort in Batangas that she described as where the BGC professionals went at weekends, £1,800. A cooking class with a chef who had trained in Paris and had returned to Manila to open a private dining experience, £600 for an evening. A day on a private yacht in Manila Bay with a catered lunch, £900. Each thing was real, each thing was beautiful, and each thing arrived with the framing that I was celebrating something earned and that spending on experiences was the intelligent use of a retirement fund rather than the reckless one. That reframing spending is investing in experience. Restraint is what you do when you have something to save toward, and I no longer had anything to save toward was the intellectual argument she was making, softly and consistently, across every conversation, and it was not entirely wrong as an argument, which made it more effective than something entirely wrong would have been. I extended my trip. I had booked 3 weeks and I stayed 6. I told myself I would fly home in October and begin settling into Liverpool retirement. October arrived and Aliana was arranging a week in Siargao and I stayed. She did not book these things without my agreement. That is the thing I need to be clear about. I agreed to everything, every booking, every upgrade, every extension. She made suggestions and I said yes, and I said yes because each individual yes felt like a reasonable choice in the context of a retirement I had waited 35 years for and which I was, for the first time, allowing myself to actually experience. We spent time together outside the hotel desk arrangements from the 3rd week onward. Dinners. First she would recommend a restaurant and sometimes join me when her shift ended, which I invited, wanting the company of someone who knew the city and could explain what I was eating and seeing. She was genuinely good company in the way of a person who is interested in things and says so directly. She told me about the booking work, about the travelers she had dealt with, about her ambition to eventually run her own travel consultancy. She told me about growing up in Makati, about a family that had pushed her toward education but had not had the resources to fully fund it, about working her way through a hospitality qualification while employed. It was a real life, told with the matter-of-factness of someone who had processed their own story and did not need anyone to feel sorry about it. I liked her. Straightforwardly and without complication, I liked her as a person, as company, as someone who made the 6 weeks feel inhabited rather than merely experienced. By November, she was no longer working at the hotel desk. She had, she told me, given notice because she was ready to begin setting up the consultancy she had been planning, and the hotel desk work was no longer consistent with where she was professionally. She did not ask me to support that. She mentioned it as information. What it meant practically was that she had more time, and more time meant more arrangements, and more arrangements meant more spending. And by November, I had been in the Philippines for nearly 3 months and had spent approximately £180,000. I did not see that number clearly as it accumulated. I was not looking at my accounts. I checked them regularly. I am not a careless person by nature. But I was looking at individual transactions rather than at the running total, which is a different kind of looking, and each individual transaction was for something real and beautiful and chosen by me. It is very difficult to look at a record of choices you made freely and see it as a disaster while you are still making the choices. The disaster is visible in aggregate. The individual choices feel like living. My sister Helen called me in November. Helen is 64, lives in Chester, and has a directness that I have been simultaneously grateful for and occasionally irritated by for 6 decades. She asked when I was coming home. I told her I had extended my stay. She asked how long. I told her I was not sure yet. She said, "Nathan, you went for 3 weeks in September." I said I knew. She said, "How much have you spent?" I told her it had been a significant trip but that I was within my means. She said, "Tell me a number." I told her approximately £200,000 at that point. There was a silence that I can only describe as Helen collecting herself before she said what she actually thought. Then she said, "Nathan, that is half of everything you have. In 2 months. Is this person involved?" I asked what she meant by that. She said, "The woman, the booking agent. Is she involved in the spending?" I told her Aliana was a friend and a local guide, and that the spending was my own choice. Helen said, "I don't doubt that it's your choice. I'm asking whether it would have been the same choices without her." I told her the question was unfair. She said, "It's the most fair question there is." I told her I needed to go. She said, "Please come home soon." I told her I would. I did not come home soon. In December, Aliana mentioned an opportunity, a luxury travel package she was developing for the consultancy she was building, targeting high-end European retirees who wanted curated Philippine experiences. She said she had been given access to a block of premium resort reservations at a significantly reduced rate through a supplier relationship, and that if she could sell them forward to clients, the margin would be the seed capital she needed to get the consultancy properly started. She said she was not asking me for anything. She was telling me because she trusted me and because she was excited and because I was one of the people whose judgment she respected. She said the block cost £85,000 and that she had identified 4 potential clients who would collectively pay £140,000 for the packaged experiences, producing a net margin of £55,000 that would fund the first year of the consultancy's operations. She said it was the opportunity she had been waiting for. Then she said, "I'll figure out how to finance it. I've done harder things." I offered to provide the £85,000. I want to be honest about the sequence she did not ask. She described the opportunity with the genuine excitement of someone who sees a path opening. She said she would figure it out herself. And I offered. I offered because I liked her and because the business logic she described was coherent, and because I had, over 3 months of increasingly expensive experience, arrived at a state of mind in which money felt different than it had ever felt before. It felt like something that existed to be used, not wasted used, applied to things that produced life rather than accumulated in a savings account in Liverpool. The spending had changed how money felt, which is one of the quietest and most dangerous things that sustained spending does to a person. I transferred £85,000. By the end of December, the total I had spent since arriving in September was £310,000. I know this because I finally sat down with my bank records in the first week of January and did the arithmetic I had been avoiding doing globally while doing it locally. £310,000 in 4 months. Of the £420,000 I had brought into retirement, I had £110,000 remaining. I sat with that number for a long time. I called Aliana and asked to meet her. She was warm and available, and we met the following afternoon at a cafe near the hotel where we had first spoken. I showed her the number on my phone. I did not say anything. She looked at it and looked at me and said, "Have you enjoyed these 4 months?" I said yes. She said, "Then you've lived. That's what the money was for." I said I had not expected to spend 3/4 of it in 4 months. She said, "You said yourself you'd been careful for 35 years. You were due some carefulness in the other direction." I did not have a clean response to that. The logic was not wrong as an emotional statement. It was completely wrong as a financial one, and I knew both things simultaneously and did not act on what I knew. I transferred £65,000 in February for what she described as a second block of resort reservations, a follow-on to the first that she said her 4 clients had already committed to purchasing, and that would consolidate the consultancy's first-year revenue base. She had not yet provided me with documentation showing the first block had sold, which I noticed and told myself was because the transactions were still in process. By February, I had £45,000 remaining of the £420,000 I had retired with. In March, I asked for a meeting to discuss both investments. She confirmed the meeting and then canceled the day before, citing a supplier emergency. She rescheduled for the following week. The following week, she canceled again. I sent a message asking specifically for the client contracts that showed the resort blocks had been sold forward. She replied saying she was gathering the documents. 3 days passed. I sent another message. 4 more days. No reply. I called her phone. It rang to voicemail. I left a message. By the end of March, her phone was no longer receiving calls. I went to the hotel to ask about her. She had left the hotel's employment voluntarily. She had given notice as she had told me, and the desk manager had no forwarding contact. I asked whether any guest had complained about booking issues. The manager was politely unhelpful. I found the address she had given me for the consultancy, a shared workspace in Makati that I went to directly. The receptionist found no record of a business registered to the name she had given me. The phone number listed on the consultancy's website, which I had visited several times, was disconnected. I flew home in April. Not because there was nothing left to do in Manila. A Philippine attorney could have been engaged and was eventually engaged through an online referral service, who took a retainer and filed a fraud complaint and told me honestly that the prospects of recovery were limited because the resort block transactions had been conducted informally, with no written agreements on my side and significant difficulty establishing that the representations about client commitments had been deliberate misrepresentations rather than failed business projections. The attorney was doing what could be done. I flew home because I had £45,000 remaining, a pension that covered my basic living costs without margin, and a retirement that had lasted 4 months. I needed to understand what was next before I could do anything useful in Manila about what had passed. Helen drove to Liverpool from Chester the week after I arrived home. She did not say "I told you so," which is a measure of the person she is, because she told me so clearly, and more than once, and would have been entirely within her rights. She arrived with food and stayed for 2 days, and we had the conversation that I think we had both been building toward for years about our parents and their careful lives and what the money they left represented, and about what I had done with it, and about what came next. At some point in that conversation, I started crying, which I had not done in a very long time and which I would not have predicted happening in that conversation. And Helen sat next to me on my sofa and was quiet, which is the best thing a person can do when another person is crying and there is nothing useful to say. She asked me, at some point when the crying had stopped and we were drinking tea, whether I blamed Aliana. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said I blamed her for the £150,000 in the resort block investments, which were misrepresented to me in ways that I now believed were deliberate. I did not blame her for the £270,000 I had spent on the experiences, because those were my choices made with full knowledge of what I was spending, even if I had not looked at the aggregate clearly enough, Helen said. Do you think she made those choices easier? I said yes. I said the way she had talked about spending as the intelligent use of a retirement fund, as the right response to a lifetime of restraint, was a consistent reframe that changed how I thought about money over the months we spent together, and that change made me more susceptible to the investment requests than I would have been in September, before she had been working on that reframe for 3 months. Helen said, So she prepared the ground and then planted something in it. I said that was about right. Helen said, Then you both bear a share of it. I said yes. That is the most honest accounting I can give. I went back to work in September of 2023. My former head teacher was surprised and not unsympathetic. He found me a position covering a long-term absence, and it has extended into a permanent part-time role. The school is familiar, the students are new, the work is what it has always been. I am not miserable in it. I was not miserable in it for 35 years, and I am not miserable in it now. What I am is different from what I expected to be at 68, which is a statement that covers a great deal without quite capturing any of it precisely. I think about Aliana sometimes, not with the bitterness I expected to feel with something more complicated. She showed me something real. The months in the Philippines were genuinely the most alive I had felt in years. The Palawan water was the color I remembered. The food and the light and the pace of it were real. She showed me that world, and she was good company in it, and the experiences were not fraudulent. They happened, and I was in them, and they were vivid. What was fraudulent was the framing she placed around them, slowly and consistently, over months, until spending felt like intelligence and restraint felt like a failure of imagination. And then when the framing had done its work, she placed an investment opportunity inside it, and the investment opportunity was fraudulent in the concrete legal sense. The lesson I carry is not the one I expected. I expected to carry a lesson about trusting people, or about verifying investments, or about not spending money on luxury when you have a finite retirement fund. Those are all accurate lessons, and I have absorbed them. The lesson I did not expect to carry is about the malleability of how money feels. I had thought of myself, for 35 years, as someone who understood money and its limits and his own relationship to it. The relationship turned out to be less stable than I believed. 3 months of sustained reframing money is for spending. Experiences are the investment. You have earned this moved me from a man who checked his savings account carefully to a man who transferred £85,000 to fund a business opportunity he had not verified. The identity I thought I had around money turned out to be situational rather than fixed. Aliana found the situation that unlocked it. I do not have a clean ending for this. The Philippine attorney continues to work the fraud complaint, which has not produced anything recoverable in the 15 months since I filed it. My pension covers my rent and my food. The teaching income covers the margin and the small things. I am not destitute. I have told that to myself often enough that it has lost some of its consoling power, but it is true. I am not destitute. I have a job I know how to do, and a sister who drives from Chester when I need her to, and a classroom that is exactly as exhausting and occasionally as alive as it always was. I am not the man who landed in Manila in September of 2022 with £420,000 and the specific hope of a teacher who has finally given himself permission to stop being careful. That man is gone in the way that all versions of ourselves are gone once the experience that required them has passed. What I am is the version that came after him, which is harder and more specific about what things cost and less inclined to mistake the feeling of living with the fact of it. That is enough. It has to be.